Hello, welcome to Chapter 16 of Geography 101. And today we're talking about the urban transformation. So we've been kind of working our way downward in scale. We started with the political order of empire. Last lecture was about the nation and the state, so that's a little bit smaller. Today we're going to go to even more smaller in cities. But it's important to note that the urban transformation has been a major shift in human life. For the first time ever, and we're talking about since we began as a species over 200, 300,000 years ago, more people live in urban environments, in cities and suburbs, than ever. And in fact, for the first time in human history, more than half of the population of the world now lives in urban cities. So the first urban revolution occurs roughly about the same time as agriculture, between 11 to 5,000 years ago. And this is the first time we see permanent cities. We'd had farmers living in small villages, but to finally get enough people to be called a city, that occurs about maybe roughly 10,000 years ago. And it varies. But it arose with agriculture. Because remember how we talked about with agriculture, you could produce more food per square mile than hunter and gathering. And that's important because you can produce more food with less people with agriculture. And in a city, there are people who don't grow their own food, right? They live in the city, they're not farmers. So you need that excess food to support the cities. Now, we tend to look at this as progress that, humans went from hunters and gatherers to farming into living in cities. And I think that's mainly due to the fact that we all live in cities. But you have to kind of wonder about this. If you look at society before farming and before urban living, hunters and gatherers had a lot more free time. It takes far less work to gather what you need from hunting and gathering than it does to grow crops. And so, with the shift to agriculture, right, we see more work. So, what are some of the impacts? Well, the first one is living standards declined. And what do we mean by that? Well, think about this. San tribes in Africa currently are hunter gatherers today. They spend about 20 hours a week on average gathering what they need for water and for food to get through their lives. So that means they're only in a sense working 20 hours a week, whereas Chinese rice farmers average about 57 hours a week. It's a lot more work to grow crops. So that's the trade-off, reliable more food, but less time. But ironically, even though farmers can produce more food, there's less variety. Think about that. If you're a corn farmer, then pretty much you eat all things corn, right? If you're a rice farmer, you eat a lot of things with their rice. But hunters and gatherers take some of this, some of that, and they can move with the seasons, so they have a much more varied diet. But less variety, although it may feed you, if you eat the same thing, makes you actually open to some kinds of foodborne diseases. And additionally, with farming, you had more people. People had bigger families, they lived longer, they had more steady food. Maybe not the most variety of food, but there were more people. And what happens when you have more people is you need to farm more areas to feed those people. So farming populations expanded in their area that they used. And this is part of the reason why the early empires grew. They had to grow to conquer more land for their farmers and for their society. Another aspect is the social order. This idea of the hierarchy, that you have the king or the chief or the priest at the top, and then his lieutenants or knights or other priests, and then you had the shop owners, and then you had the traders, and then maybe the farmers at the bottom. The idea that there are people who had a higher rank than you socially. In a hunter gathering tribe, it's very egalitarian. Everyone is pretty much equal because if you're living in a hunter gathering lifestyle, right, and you don't agree with whoever the chief is, it's very easy just to walk away and start your own tribe. So people tend to work together much more closely. But in a city, you really don't have that option. So the pre-industrial city, and this is the cities around the world before the year 17, 1800, had a very distinct layout. And the layout of the cities uniquely, the way they were laid out spatially, reflected in many ways the same way that society was organized. At the center of the city, or the top of society, you had the elite. So In the top of society, you had the elite, the leaders. Then below them, the lower class. And then below them, the very, very bottom, the minorities, the outcasts, the unclean, if you will. In a city, in the center of an ancient city, in the center of town was the temple, or the castle, or the fortress. And that's where the elite lived. Surrounding them were the lower class. And on the outskirts of city, again, the outcast minority. So kind of a interesting mirroring, if you will. First, urban cities were vulnerable. I pulled this quote from your textbook. It's very interesting. This is 4,000 years ago. And as you read this, think about it. What they're saying is that there was no rain. There was no grain, which meant no rain, meant no grain, no fish, no crops. So that's a pretty bad thing. They're talking about a drought, right? First, urban revolution, cities were very vulnerable, especially to ecological collapse. So I've talked a little bit about the Maya here, right? And this is Guatemala, but in the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, Honduras, that whole area, at one point a very sophisticated urban society, but they basically used their environment to the point where it collapsed and could not support them, right? There were constant demands for food and water. I mean, one of the things we're seeing right now, right, in our society, this demand for food and water, is that even though we're all supposed to be locked down and being separate from everybody, some things never stopped working. No one once questioned whether the grocery stores would ever close, and they haven't. In fact, if people even think that the grocery stores are going to close, what happens? People go and they start buying things in panic, like toilet paper or canned food. You notice they were gone for a while, now they're back. Cities need that food and water. And if the environment around it is not able to supply it, then people are going to leave the city. Today, this isn't as big of a deal. If there was a crop failure here in the United States, if we didn't have any corn, right, that wouldn't be the worst thing because we could ship food in by truck or train or plane from around the world. But if you go back 1,000 years ago, think about the Maya here in the Yucatan. The whole area undergoes an ecological collapse. All of a sudden, the crops don't grow as well as they did. Where else are they going to find food? They can't just get in their boats or their cars or their trains. And so a lot of isolation of these urban areas, they start collapsing. Very, very sensitive to it. And then we also saw how cities can change society. So urbanization, right? This is the idea of people living in cities as opposed to the country. So that's a spatial aspect, but there's also this social aspect. People who live in cities have a very different social life. And a good example of this is the merchant city. So as cities grew in the Middle Ages, Venice is an example, certain individuals became very wealthy by trade, by providing goods and services. So all of a sudden, power arose outside of the nobility. If you go back to the earliest cities in ancient Greece, you had the ruling elite, the kings, the dukes, the knights, the priests, the top of the society. But with urbanization and more people living in cities and more trade going on, people that weren't royal or elite basically could buy their way into power. And so you see the growth of the merchant class begin. Okay? All right. Also with that, as people became wealthier and had more power, this idea that you had a duty to kind of be part of the civic realm, to help care for and run the city, that also emerges too. This idea that you do for the city, that you work as part of the city and work for your city. All right, we're going to pause right here, and we'll come back with part 2 in just a little bit.